Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to this first ever Central and East European Coalition Policy webinar. Those that are not familiar with the Central and East European Coalition may not know that this is not the first time that we're doing policy briefings, as we generally host yearly briefings on Capitol Hill on relevant topics for U.S. national security interests. But this is the first time in the era of COVID that we are doing a policy briefing online, remotely, and we welcome our speakers on this particular topic. Topic and the title of today's discussion is Resilience and Russian Interference, Neutralizing the Kremlin's Campaign to Dismantle Democracy. The genesis of this particular discussion today stemmed from a June 18th, 2020 op-ed in the National Interest that was titled Real Lessons of the 75th Anniversary of World War II. The op-ed was penned by President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and it was nothing more than a propaganda stint. It was replete with historical inaccuracies, revisionism, disinformation, and obviously just an attempt to bring and sow discord within the Western world. So we have brought together panelists which will explore the effective counter-narratives to fight back on multiple levels of Russian disinformation, including the political, economic, and military spheres. We have assembled a truly dynamic and knowledgeable group of experts to discuss this very topic of Russian disinformation and how best that we can combat it. Let me introduce our speakers and panelists to you in the following manner. Ambassador William Courtney, who is the Adjunct Senior Fellow and Executive Director at the RAND Corporation. He has worked in numerous U.S. government positions, including as Senior Director at the National Security Council, the staff for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, former Ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan, and has also served abroad at U.S. posts within Brasilia and Moscow. Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis at CEPA. He has a stellar military career with various tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And his last military assignment was as Commanding General of the United States Army Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany, from 2014 to 2017. Mr. David Kramer joins us from the Florida International University as Senior Fellow in the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights. He was formerly at the McCain Institute as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy, former President of the Freedom House, Senior Atlantic Fellow at German Marshall Fund, and served many years in the U.S. State Department, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. And then Vikoras Daukšas. He is the head of Debunk EU initiative, which is an independent technology think tank and non-governmental organization based in Lithuania that searches disinformation and runs educational media literacy campaigns. Debunk EU conducts disinformation analysis in the Baltic states as well as the United States. We welcome our panelists. We thank you for your time and the opportunity to have this discussion with you. And I open it up with opening remarks from Ambassador Bill Courtney. Mr. Ambassador.
Michael, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you, and I'm honored to join you. In the 1990s, the Central and East Europe Coalition made a major contribution to mobilizing support in Washington for U.S. programs in the region. I'm heartened that the coalition remains active today. To provide context for today's discussion, I will look back at Soviet-era efforts to weaken the West and those struggling for freedom, and draw some parallels today. The USSR made intensive use of active measures or covert or deceptive practices to buttress its policies. Disinformation, forgeries, and covert political influence operations were and remain part of Moscow's active measures toolkit. Then and now, Moscow has used propaganda to broaden the reach of covert active measures. Then and now, Moscow has viewed active measures as a low-cost or asymmetric weapon. But active measures are not unique to the Soviet Union and Russia. In the Civil War, President Lincoln wanted to prevent England from backing the Confederate cause. He made secret payments so that activists in England would organize anti-slavery demonstrations. In the early Cold War, the US government secretly funded Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Supposedly, they were independent surrogate radios. In the 1980s in Poland, the US provided covert support to the Solidarity Trade Union. Overall, however, Moscow has relied far more on active measures, nearly always to suppress freedom rather than expand it. Most recently, President Putin has falsely blamed the West for applying external pressure on Belarus. Let me cite several examples of active measures from the Soviet era, some of which will seem familiar today. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the USSR falsely said the Kabul government had invited it. Moscow also lied in claiming that its purpose was to save Muslims from imperialist attack. The Soviet Union distributed bogus US wartime plans to undermine confidence of NATO allies and publics. To fool gullible foreigners, the Kremlin created so-called friendship societies and the World Peace Council, a Soviet front group. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev repeatedly lied about suspending secret deployments of SS-20 missiles aimed at Europe and Japan. The Kremlin lied that the KAL-007 airliner, downed in 1983, had been gathering intelligence. The USSR claimed the US had created the AIDS virus in its biological weapons program. Moscow alleged that an anthrax outbreak in 1979, which killed perhaps hundreds of people, was the result of eating tainted meat rather than a mishap in its illegal biological weapons program. Perhaps the most famous active measure was the Soviet contention that in Katyn Forest, the Nazis had massacred thousands of Polish military officers and intelligentsia. Prior to the advent of the Gorbachev era in 1985, the Kremlin rarely, if ever, admitted the truth about these matters, but things began to change. In 1987, President Gorbachev acknowledged the existence of all SS-20 deployments when he signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with President Reagan. In 1990, the Gorbachev government admitted Soviet responsibility for the Katyn bloodbath. After the Soviet collapse, Russian President Yeltsin released KAL-007 black boxes to the International Civil Aviation Organization. He also admitted that Soviet military efforts had caused the anthrax outbreak. Let me draw several parallels with today. In both Afghanistan and the Eastern Ukraine wars, Moscow has lied about the presence of its forces, apparently to hide the truth from its own people, as well as to try to fool naive foreign audiences. In both the KAL-007 and the MH17 shootdowns, Moscow has sought to lie about those circumstances, despite strong evidence to the contrary. In the secret deployments of both the SS-20 in the Soviet era and the new Russian cruise missile, the Kremlin has wrongly thought that Europeans would blame Washington, not Moscow, for fanning military flames. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Kremlin's use of hostile active measures is that only if political liberalization comes might these measures decline or come to an end. Then, it took the arrival in the Kremlin of Gorbachev and later Yeltsin. Today, we can hope that political liberalization will again emerge in Russia, but we do not know if or when. Thank you.
Bill, thank you. Excellent remarks. General Hodges.
Thanks, Michael. So what I'd like to do is use the what we call the DIME construct, D-I-M-E, for diplomacy, information, military, and economic as the four main types of national power or alliance power that can be used. And as a retired Army guy, I greatly prefer that the M is lowercase and that the D, I, and E are uppercase. In other words, that the United States, NATO, and coalitions should emphasize diplomatic power, information power, and economic power before resorting to the use of military power. But getting the combination right is important. I also believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict, and we should not shrink back from competing in all four of these categories, particularly in the information domain. And Ambassador Courtney, one of our most distinguished and experienced diplomats, knows or laid out some examples of how and why. So let me start diplomacy. What's going on right now? I think Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in particular have set a terrific example for everybody about political courage, but also the way that they have put their voices together. Today, I would imagine that probably almost every member of the US Congress could correctly identify Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on a map because of the combined efforts of these three nations and their governments working together to raise attention in Washington and also in Brussels to the threats and why that area is important. And I wish that that's what would happen in the Black Sea region, that our allies and partners there would put their voices together in Washington and in Brussels to draw attention to why the Black Sea matters to us, not just to them. And certainly we're missing not having a confirmed ambassador in Minsk today. So fortunately, people like Minister Linkevicius are stepping forward and providing that loud voice to try to unify European efforts because we don't have a strong American voice there. In the information domain, just recently, the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a firm rebuttal of the recent sham elections in Crimea, saying that because Crimea had been illegally annexed, therefore any elections that were administered there, as happened earlier this week, were obviously a sham and would not be recognized by anybody in Estonia. All three of the Baltic nations have recently called for OSCE investigations of the human rights violations in Belarus. This kind of unified action in the information space is very important to continue to shine the light on what the Kremlin is doing, both overtly and covertly. And I thought it was ironic, and when I read it, it was a tweet that came out yesterday from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the anniversary of the September 17, 1939 invasion of Poland by the Soviet Union. And the ministry was responding to all the criticisms out in the Twitter sphere about their invasion. And the official statement from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was that the USSR took Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine under their protection because they had been occupied by Poland. And when I first read it, I thought actually it was a spoof because it was such a ridiculous thing, but that's really the point. They say the most blatant things and they keep saying it over and over in hopes that it gets some kind of traction. And I think the way that we compete with this, of course, is to continue to shine the light with our much better narrative. And also paying attention to things like the spelling, the English spelling of Belarusia that the Russian ministry uses, of course, is different from the official one that's used by Belarus and the West. In the military domain, of course, the alliance responded quickly in 2006 or 2014, and then in 2016 at the NATO summit at Warsaw, the alliance agreed that we had to increase our posture in the Baltic states and in Poland to transition from just assurance to deterrence, which means having real capability. And so Germany led a battle group into Lithuania, Canada led a battle group into Latvia, UK led the battle group into Estonia, and the United States led a battle group into Poland. Each of these are multinational. And the symbolism of having Italy, Spain, Croatia, providing forces for these NATO battle groups is powerful, that even countries on the southern part of NATO care and recognize the threat that Russia poses. So this cohesion is so important that we can't let the Kremlin try and split that off. Now, also in the military domain, what Lithuania and Latvia in particular have done, which should be adopted by every other country in the alliance, especially Germany, is they have figured out how to put cyber under the Ministry of Defense so that any investment in cyber protection of our critical transportation infrastructure counts towards their 2%. And certainly, since everybody acknowledges that Russia will use cyber, is using cyber, then defense against cyber is part of this collective defense effort, because we all depend on the European transportation infrastructure. This is a place where we have got to continue pushing back in this era of great power competition. And finally, in the economic domain, I saw that Estonia has just joined the 3Cs initiative, a particular aspect of the investment forum. This is very important. You know, Secretary Pompeo back in February at the Munich Security Conference announced that the United States would be putting in $1 billion into the 3Cs initiative, using the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation as the mechanism to do this. This is a recognition that economic investment, private investment, is just as important to competing with China, competing with the Kremlin, and also helping Eastern European allies and partners get weaned off of Russian energy. Two last examples I would highlight. The fact that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have just agreed to reject any electricity coming from the Ostrovets nuclear power plant in Belarus was important. That's not an easy decision. They can't just switch off, but this is going to force them to be able to connect into Western European power versus paying into the Ostrovets nuclear power plant and the Russian and Belarusian power generation model. And of course, the people in Vilnius are so concerned, and rightfully, about this power plant becoming another Chernobyl. Not too many people have a lot of confidence in the safety measures there. One other thing that could be done is European countries declaring that any ship that sails out of Crimea is contraband. You should not be allowed to sail from Sevastopol, for example, into any other European port, because those ports are technically closed by the Ukrainian government. And so a way in the information space and the economic space that we can continue to draw attention to the illegal annexation of Crimea is by declaring any vessel coming from Crimea as contraband. And that's competition.
Excellent. What a wonderful comprehensive review, especially of DIME. And yes, I agree with you, General. Let's try to use the M as less as possible. David, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Michael, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me to join this great panel. Very pleased to be with you this morning. Let me make a few points looking at the title of today's session, Resilience and Russian Interference, Neutralizing the Kremlin's Campaign to Dismantle Democracy. And I think the first point is we have to recognize the Putin regime as a threat, as an existential threat, in fact. And it's a threat to its own people. We've just seen this most vividly in the case of Alexei Navalny with his poisoning and hopefully his recovery in a German hospital, the brutal crackdowns that have taken place across the country, and now possibly threats with deployment of forces to the Far East. Let's hope that that doesn't affect the people who are voicing their opposition to the Kremlin in Khabarovsk. It's certainly a threat to its neighbors. And we've seen this most vividly again to the cyber attack against Estonia in 2007, the invasion of Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, and threats against other countries along its borders. And we see this a threat to the United States. FBI Director Christopher Wray was explicit yesterday in his description of the ongoing and existing Russian threat to the United States and its interference in our election, its efforts to sow division and discord, and it will remain a threat to us, I fear, for quite a while. If it doesn't respect its own countries, its own population's human rights, it's not going to respect the human rights of people in other countries, and it also likely means it's not going to respect concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And so that makes it a threat. Second, Putin sees democracy as a threatening alternative to the system he has in place in Russia, to his authoritarian kleptocratic regime. And that means Putin wants to try to destabilize his neighbors so that they do not become successful alternative models to what he has constructed in Russia. He may not be so interested in taking over his neighboring states so much because he doesn't want that responsibility, but he doesn't want these countries to succeed. Obviously, in Russia's national interest, not Putin's interest, but in Russia's national interest, they should want to see successful countries along their border. That isn't what Mr. Putin wants. Third, I think it's really over time to see RT and Svoboda and other tools and outlets as what they are. These are not media outlets. These are not journalists. These are tools in the Kremlin's propaganda campaign. And so I do not fault countries that may want to shut these outlets down. They're not reporting the news. They're trying to create chaos, sow dissension, and feed distrust in the countries where they are broadcast. So I think we should cut a little more slack, particularly for countries that sadly are engaged in hostilities with Russia, such as Ukraine, if they want to crack down on this. Fourth, let's make sure we're not useful idiots in the Russian campaign. And that just opens up the door for them to succeed. I applaud the Treasury Department's sanction last week on Daukšas, which I think was a great move, and a signal that there are some parts of the government that are looking out for efforts to try to manipulate our system, manipulate certain individuals for political purposes that are negative for the United States as a whole. We need to see more steps like that. We also need to see our own political leaders commit to facts, to science-based analysis, because when we engage in our own disinformation campaign, we open the door wide open for external efforts at disinformation. This leads me to the fifth point, which is don't fall for the disinformation that we see on social media. That is simply trying to exploit divisions and discord in our country, tensions. They're trying to inflame tensions. Our consumers of social media need to be more discerning in what they see and also need to be a little more careful in what they retweet. And I would say that applies to the highest levels of our government. Sixth point is we need to expose more in the area of Russian corruption. Alexei Navalny and his foundation, which has been under siege and attack, have done an amazing job on this. But there's more we can do on this to expose what we know through our intelligence in the way of massive Russian corruption from the highest levels of their government. And then final point, we need to see these efforts as part of a larger problem. I mentioned at the beginning that the Putin regime, in my view, poses a serious threat, even an existential threat. Disinformation is a part of this threat. It is, we sometimes get so fixated on disinformation that we lose sight of the bigger picture. Disinformation is a tactic, a tool that the Kremlin uses. Unless we address the bigger problem, which is the Putin regime, we're going to continue to have this. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You whack them here and they pop up somewhere else. We have to recognize the Putin regime for what it is. And try our best to contain the threat and also help neighboring states in dealing with an aggressive and threatening Russia. Thanks.
Excellent, David. I took a lot of notes during your presentation, so I'll have some follow-up questions for you. Vikoras, please.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting. I will share the screen to show some slides. So we are doing the analysis from a big data perspective, and we're trying to portray what is happening at the large scale and what type of campaigns are happening and what is the impact of that. First, I would say that it's important to look at disinformation from the cost perspective, because this shows how big is this problem and how can it be solved or reduced. So if you look on disinformation side, you can see that in disinformation side, we have these coordinated efforts. We see trained forces, we see strategy in place. We know that they are quite well funded and they are in generally cheap labor countries, which makes creation of disinformation campaigns and content pretty cheap. And speaking about debunking, so we see that the efforts are very fragmented. There are many different small organizations who more compete than cooperate. Detection in real time, it's really difficult and may be very expensive. Collection of evidences, facts, providing and debunking and publishing fact checks, it's really hard and takes a lot of time. And the outreach to citizens may be really expensive or sometimes even impossible if those people were impacted by disinformation campaign. So how you are getting back to them, informing them that they were subject of mis or disinformation. So we ask the question, how do we change this balance? And we believe that the answer is that we need to cooperate more. We need to automate the features, automate the manual work, and do more working together between organizations. So here's an example of the process that we developed. This is maybe 8 iteration over last 3 years that we worked on. And we empower AI as the first step to detect potential or harmful content or potential disinformation. Then we use two human layers to review the content. So we have elves who are the group of volunteers. In Lithuania, we have between 4,000 and 5,000 elves that are working in social media to catch trolls. So elves are helping to review the content and mark it if it's disinformation or misinformation. The analysts are doing the later job of labeling, to label the content, to label misinformation, disinformation, different techniques that are used in these particular content pieces that we later use for, again, training AI. Then journalists and analysts work together to create these charts, the reports, so visualize everything, and to prepare the content piece to be published. And so the citizens and other stakeholders would know what is actually happening there at the in the big picture. So let's take a look on a few examples. So this is the recent disinformation campaign that was against Defender 2020 military drills, military exercises here in Baltics. And we can see that Russian disinformation sphere portrayed these exercises super negatively. 70% of all the content that we analyzed over 9 months was portrayed negatively. And they were trying to push narratives as these huge exercises will be a way to spread COVID, and that will make a disaster in the Baltic states. And when the Defender was paused because of quarantine, then they were portraying that it's a failure of NATO not being able to do these exercises as they are planned. Here you can see different websites. So this is the top website that we're publishing about publishing disinformation about Defender 2020 exercises. And from the content in the red side, you see that this is the most negative content pieces in those portals. And you can see a very clear disbalance. If the portal is publishing 70, 80, or 90% negative content about that particular issue, there is something wrong with that portal. And we can then dig deeper and find these relations and also the problems that are hidden there. So here's an example of different narratives that were pushed against Defender. And the most popular was that NATO is offensive alliance. The second was that Russia doesn't escalate tensions while NATO does the opposite, and that Russians are the imaginary threat. And as we hear from other speakers, that is actually not true. And Russians are trying just to portray this and play with people's minds and hearts to spoil them, so people would believe in different story. Another example is of COVID disinformation analysis. We analyzed about 10,000 content pieces over the quarantine period in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and we found 617 cases of disinformation. And what is huge is that these more than 600 cases had 123 million contacts with real people. So that is a lot. That is huge impact of these disinformation campaigns and their ways to spread over social media. And in the beginning of the quarantine, we see that there was a lot of disinformation and later it reduced because it just saturated. Another way we approach this and analyze, we look what type of different narratives are spreading in different countries. During quarantine period, we had the most popular narrative was that Russophobia exists in Baltic countries. So this was the top narrative in Estonia and in Latvia. And in Lithuania, they communicated a lot about corona psychosis, or Lithuanian justice system is flawed and is not being able to fight COVID. So now we as an organization operate in 6 countries. We produce something like 70 reports per year. We have 50 volunteers who are working, and 15 of staff that is fully working daily with debunking this information. Thank you.
Vikoras, thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for excellent presentations. I am remiss to say that I got so excited at the very beginning of this that I forgot to introduce myself. I am Michael Sawkiw from the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, one of the members of the Central and East European Coalition, which is a coalition of 18 US national organizations that represents between 20 to 22 million Americans of Central and East European descent. So welcome again, everyone. I think we've had a very interesting first 30 minutes in terms of the presentations. For questions and answers, I just would like to remind you to please submit your questions in the Q&A function in the chat and in the function box on the bottom of your screen as you see it, and we'll answer those questions appropriately. I would like to take the prerogative as chair of, as moderator of today's discussion to actually ask one question to all of the panelists and how you can answer it all individually based upon specifics that you had mentioned within your presentations. I would like to share a screen of a report that just came out from State Department from the Global Engagement Center. And the Global Engagement Center is an institution or an agency that was just incorporated within the United States Department of State, interacts with various agencies, and has just issued a report about Russian disinformation. The opening statement within the report goes as follows. As the United States government's dedicated Center for Countering Foreign Disinformation and Propaganda, the Global Engagement Center at the US Department of State has a mandate to expose and counter threats from malign actors that utilize these tactics. In this field, Russia continues to be a leading threat. As you see within the 5 pillars of the State Department report, they all amount to how Russia is using disinformation, whether it is official government communications, state-funded global messaging, cultivation of other sources, weaponization of social media, which obviously is very popular nowadays, and cyber-enabled disinformation. Most interesting, I just, in preparation for this, read in the budget for Russian disinformation. It is actually part of their state budget. Not called disinformation, however, but it amounts to about 1.3 billion euros, or about 1.5 to 1.6 billion dollars. We have a question that has been submitted here that I would like to as well make a part of my question is, given that we know about the extent of Russian disinformation, how is it that individuals and or organizations or these websites or these TV channels are not being prosecuted more? Why are they not necessarily being brought to justice here within the United States? And how can we partner with our other allies throughout the world to make sure that they do the same things? And I'll start off maybe by with Bill, and then we'll Ambassador Courtney, and then we'll go through the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Michael. I think the key issue is a lot of those things are not violations of US law, either federal law or state and local law. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak authoritatively on that. So the focus of the US really in dealing with active measures in the Soviet period. For example, in those days, the Soviet active measures report, somewhat similar to the new GEC report, was published, exposing a wide range of activities undertaken. The focus of US efforts has been to make publics and allies, international publics, aware of the kinds of distortions, the kinds of measures that Soviet Union, of course now Russia, use so that they can better prepare themselves to become more resilient to that kind of misinformation and deception.
General Hodges?
So I'm also a little uneasy when you start talking about legal action against quasi-media organizations. We'd want to be very careful. Clearly, some of them are not media organizations and should be shut down or blocked or exposed. But I personally believe that the approach needs to be more in terms of competing. We have a better story to tell. We're not real good at telling it, and we undermine our own narrative when we don't live up to our own ideals of liberal democracy. You know, our election process, you know, in the U.S. right now, it's kind of ugly, and it makes it harder to be critical of Russian disinformation efforts when our own constitutional pillars are not as strong and clear as they need to be. So we've got to live up to our own ideals as part of this competition in the information space. Now, I am 100% in favor of slamming the banking accounts and the financial systems that are used to support these kinds of operations, and that also are being used to enrich President Putin and his closer circle of friends. And for some reason, we seem to be reluctant to do that. And it's not that we can't figure it out. I mean, that would not be that hard for us to figure out how the money's flowing. I don't understand why there's a reluctance there. Finally, you know, the Washington Post used to have this thing, the Pinocchio chart. I love looking at it. Every time an American politician would say something on either side that would stretch the limits of true integrity, they might be awarded 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 Pinocchios. And I thought this was a wonderful way to challenge. And so I tried to do that in U.S. Army Europe whenever somebody from the Kremlin would see something outrageous. And we started doing it every week, and we would, in our own internal briefings, would show Pinocchios, and it was funny. And I got shut down from doing that, not because of copyright infringement, but because there's a reluctance to go after it, to challenge. And so we've got to overcome that too.
No, General, it's very interesting you mentioned about the Pinocchio chart, because State Department recently had this as well, especially right after the invasion of Ukraine. In their daily briefing, they actually had top 25 lies emanating from the Russian Federation. And much like you, it subsequently stopped fairly quickly after that. So having something like this, I think, would be a useful tool in terms of mitigating that Russian disinformation. David, please.
Well, let me just say there actually have been legal actions taken against Russian entities. And while Bill and Ben were talking, I dug up the indictment of the Internet Research Agency. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's 37 pages, but let me just read some critical parts here. It says the United States, through its departments and agencies, regulates the activities of foreign individuals and entities in and affecting the United States in order to prevent, disclose, and counteract improper foreign influence on U.S. elections and on the U.S. political system. U.S. law bans foreign nationals from making certain expenditures of financial disbursements for the purpose of influencing federal elections. U.S. law also bars agents of any foreign entity from engaging in political activities within the United States without first registering with the Attorney General. And it goes on to describe the Internet Research Agency as a Russian organization engaged in operations to interfere with elections and political processes, and says that since around 1914, the defendants, the Internet Research Agency, and a whole number of people, individuals listed connected to it, knowingly and intentionally conspired with each other, persons known and unknown to the grand jury, to defraud the United States by impairing, obstructing, and defeating the lawful functions of the U.S. government through fraud and deceit for the purpose of interfering with the U.S. political and electoral processes. So, to be fair, we have taken actions, and the sanctions that Ben referred to are also can be challenged in a court of law. So those are lawful actions as well. So there have been efforts made to go after people and entities from Russia and frankly elsewhere, who are interfering with our electoral process. And the last point I'll make is the ability to actually take these individuals or entities to trial is actually incredibly difficult. And in fact, I think, if I remember right, the Department of Justice has dropped one of the cases because the defendants were going to use the discovery process as a way to ferret out our sources and means of gathering information about them. So it's very tricky to go after them, but certainly denying them visas and freezing their assets is the minimum steps that we can take.
Thank you, David. Vikoras?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I would say that it's really difficult to regulate this. You know, we're living in times when the history is written. And with social media, with all the technologies, the algorithms, everything is pretty different. And what disinformation actors are doing, they're using democracy values to degrade democracy. And that is the big problem, that you know, the main thing what we are trying to hold on is working against itself. And they're playing the games, and it's a kingdom of broken mirrors, and they're portraying things as they are not, but with this huge outreach and multiple times of repetition, it becomes believable to people. And citizens who are spending a lot of time in social media, they are getting misinformed, they're getting wrong information about COVID, then they're starting to do weird things and end up in the hospitals. So it's a big problem. And the long-term solution is education. And we need to educate citizens on to think more critically, to understand what is real information, how to do a very simple fact check to verify the information. And we're trying to do that. Another thing I think it's really important is to show the bigger scale of what is actually happening, because that gives a better understanding, the scale of it and magnitude of how many things are happening and why it's important to understand that. And we did that a lot of times by presenting the results, what we find, by running the educational campaigns to citizens, and we see that these things work. And later, the people who got this information, were touched with our content, they are more resilient. And I think that's a direction. If we are touching the subject of content regulation, so this is a very tricky one, and we don't know where we can end up here. And I would suggest that more and more cooperation between NGOs, think tanks, and governments should be made of. And you know, the governments has the problem of debunking disinformation or misinformation, because they are labeled as Ministry of Truth. And when they are when they are cooperating with independent organizations, everything becomes more transparent. And I think it's a better narrative to present what's happening there.
Excellent.
Hey, Michael, can I just add two things quickly? You know, the Department of Justice also required RT to register as a foreign agent. Yeah. And so that is another step that has been taken. Mm-hmm. The other point I would make is it is not helpful, to say the least, when the Attorney General and the President of the United States deliberately try to downplay the profile of Russia in this interference and keep trying to say China, China, China. China is obviously a threat and a problem. I don't want to suggest otherwise. But FBI Director Wray yesterday and other intelligence officials have been crystal clear that the bigger threat right now is Russia. It's not to say China should be ignored, but Russia right now is actively engaged in trying to hurt Vice President Biden's campaign and trying to help President Trump. And President Trump simply doesn't want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the attributes of all this information and how best to weed through it. And obviously, to the extent of what is coming from foreign actors, from foreign governments, and obviously even what's being sowed in terms of the discontent here, in terms of our democratic institutions. So we have to be mindful of all of this. I would like to introduce my colleague, Karen Shui from the Estonian American National Committee. She will be handling the questions that have been asked in the Q&A function. Please submit your questions if you haven't yet in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Karen, please.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so we have a couple related ones right now asking what can individuals and organizations like the CEEC do to expose and combat disinformation, what venues are most expensive, and then what can we do to increase lobbying campaigns that, additional as sanctions be introduced against the Kremlin's energy companies and banks, including Nord Stream 2 and the Sberbank, as a deterrent measure against Kremlin's expansionism. So more from our side of it, what can individuals and citizens and voters go out and do constitutionally?
And just as a caveat, not the word lobbying, but advocacy, please.
Right, sorry. The question said lobbying. We do advocacy. Yes, thank you.
Please. Was this addressed to anyone in particular?
It was, no, neither one was. So.
Just one, one quick comment. Individuals on social media can expose disinformation, for example, highlight that. That's something every individual can do. Secondly, in the last couple of years, think tanks in Washington, a number of think tanks have written reports on disinformation and given more attention to this. For advocacy organizations to develop their own information, but also play off the think tank reports, will give them additional tools. CEEC is a great example, but there are others as well that can do the kind of thing you're doing today.
General, David?
Yeah, I would only add that the U.S. Congress plays such an important role, and maybe more than in the past when it comes to foreign policy. The Congress is very strongly bipartisan in its support of the alliance. So people that are interested, think tanks, advocacy groups, I would work hard to get ensure continued congressional support for American leadership in Europe, and for doing exactly what David Kramer just highlighted, the fact that you've got to call out the Russians for what they're doing, and if the administration won't do it, the Congress has significant constitutional powers to continue to address this, whether it's through appropriations, hearings, and a variety of other measures.
I agree with you, General, and as a matter of fact, a prime example was in 2007 when Congress initiated the CAATSA sanctions regime. And this was for sanctions against the Russian Federation, against North Korea, and also against Iran and Syria. So I think this is a prime example of how the United States Congress, in a bipartisan manner, as CAATSA was overwhelmingly supported 92-0 in the United States Senate, and I think it was close to 95% within the US House of Representatives. A current bill, which actually expands CAATSA that much more, specifically to Russia, though, is called DASCA, Deterring Against Security and Kremlin Aggression Act. And therefore, I think this is another good opportunity for Congress to step up to the plate when it comes to these particular aspects. This is something that we, as constituent organizations of the Central and East European Coalition, have been doing, have been meeting with respective offices, both in the House and on the Senate, on this particular topic. And again, this is another opportunity for Congress to weigh in on this very hefty matter. David, you had a comment?
Just quickly, I would say, one way to do it is obviously to support organizations like Vikoras's Stop Fake in Ukraine. There are also organizations in the United States that do this, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the Atlantic Council's DFRL lab. So there are a number of entities doing this in Europe here and in the United States. But as Vikoras said, it's overwhelming. There's so much Russian disinformation that is flooding the system that it is hard for us to respond to it, and we shouldn't respond by engaging in our own disinformation. We should help these countries know what the facts are so that they can try to filter what is disinformation from what the real story is.
Vikoras?
Yeah, I would like to share two things. So one is that an example of a recent campaign that was a protest in Lithuania against Lukashenko fraudulent elections. And we had 50,000 Lithuanians going down the streets for this protest. And what was a good thing in this, that we have this elf community who is working in online and social media to catch the trolls and find them and to report them to Facebook, so they would, or other social media platforms, so they would be banned. And what is a good example here is that over the live feeds of the protests, there were many comments by trolls in YouTube, in the comment section, and they were trolling. They were trying to portray that this event is organized by Western countries. It's a way to influence elections in Belarus, all anti-NATO and anti-EU sentiments. And what happened here, that there was a group of elves who are the active citizens, and they were working in the comment section to report instantly if they spot those trolls, so YouTube could remove those comments. And if multiple people are clicking on this, and as a community, as I mentioned, there is between 4,000 and 5,000 citizens in Lithuania who are working on this. So that is a good grassroots example of when citizens are educated and they are able to understand who is doing that, and they are protecting those who are not able to protect themselves or understand what is happening there. So that could be one angle. The other part is that it's a bit scary of what can be done with bot networks or semi-automated accounts, and what is called now inauthentic behavior. And this could be regulated, and social media platforms should be responsible for spotting these type of networks and blocking them, because they are super dangerous. They're able to play with the algorithms, push up the content that is disinformation, and that is spreading as like a wildfire, and it's being controlled by these networks. So I think this part could be, there's other things that could be done here, and social media platforms should open more to make the data more open for NGOs and other organizations who could analyze those archives of data to spot those campaigns and to prevent them from reappearing again.
Useful information, extremely useful information. Karen, do we have any other questions?
We do have several. So while we're kind of on, what we can do to solve the problem, our event description refers to the 3 Cs initiative that will bolster integration, increase US influence, and affect the Kremlin's influence in the region. So can we dig a little deeper into your thoughts on the future of better North-South connections in the region and how they might help secure independence from the nations that still have to turn to Russia for some resources?
Ambassador, General, I know, General, you had mentioned the 3 Cs in your presentation. If you'd like to respond, Ambassador Courtney.
Let me defer to the General because he has been specific about that.
Thanks, Ambassador. So I do believe that private investment is an essential part of American efforts to build stability and security, so that, first of all, young people choose to stay home, that they want to stay in their home country and see it grow, see it thrive. So private investment is important there. And if we don't, then the Chinese are going to show up with sacks full of money and create debt traps after they've built infrastructure. So we've got to compete here. And I would recommend, by the way, that Greece should be included at the bottom end of this vertical infrastructure alignment. Greece is not just an Aegean country, it's a Balkan country. It's the back door into the Black Sea region. So the 3 Cs initiative is an area where I think we can make a lot of progress. Ambassador Jeff Pyatt down in Greece has been advocating that Greece be included there. But there are other projects that are vertical that have great potential, but they require effort. Rail Baltica, to me, it's embarrassing that Rail Baltica is still incomplete. I mean, this rail network would connect Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to the rest of Europe on a European gauge rail, but there has been a variety of issues, leadership changes, and frankly, disagreements between 3 close allies, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, on various aspects of this project. And the longer that delays, it just slows down progress. And then there's one other project that's out there that I think has great potential, but there's a lot of challenges. The EU refers to it as the E40, and this would be a waterway that would connect the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, involving rivers and canals from Poland through Belarus and down through Ukraine. Obviously, there's 100 challenges to it, and Belarus is not exactly a place worthy of investment right now, but you can see the potential of economic investment, what that would do for improving, especially transportation that helps move product around.
David, Vikoras, if you'd like to add to that? No? Karen?
So I guess since General Hodges mentioned Belarus, it seems like since that's such a hot topic right now, we should talk about maybe how Belarus fits into these configurations. Lukashenko seems to have gotten support from Putin in terms of manpower, money, and material, and he's not standing down. Is this a battle of attrition?
General? David?
Well, I mean, I do think the West has been very slow in its response after the people of Belarus made very clear that they have had enough of Lukashenko after 26 years. And we still don't have sanctions imposed. This is now more than a month after the August 9th fraudulent election that Lukashenko stole. I understand that sanctions are coming from both the EU and the United States. Cyprus has actually become a bit of a hang-up over this issue, getting agreement among the 27. But I am worried that the people of Belarus, who have incredibly and courageously gone out in the streets repeatedly, despite terrible threats to their liberty, their health, their life, I fear that they are starting to feel let down by the West. This is not a geopolitical competition. The people of Belarus didn't go out waving Russian flags or EU flags. They went out waving the flags of Belarus. They want better for their country. And I do worry that we are leaving them abandoned. And I also wonder, and I hope people in the Kremlin are thinking that if they are perceived as too heavy-handed in their support for Lukashenko, that they are going to turn a situation that has not been anti-Russian into an anti-Russian sentiment among the population. The Kremlin has an opportunity to blow this badly. If they would help facilitate the departure of Lukashenko, that would go over extremely well within the country. And no one that I know of, and not many people inside Belarus, are eager to break away from close ties with Russia. They're not looking for membership in NATO or the EU. They're looking for better for their future. And so this is a critical issue right now, and I don't think it's getting enough attention.
General, please.
Yeah, first of all, I wholeheartedly endorse everything that David just said. I think the French actually are being extremely unhelpful here because of the Cyprus and Eastern Mediterranean issue and the support of the French, that they're holding the rest of the EU hostage on doing something meaningful against Lukashenko and his circle of supporters. And that tells you how France prioritizes this, that Cyprus and Eastern Mediterranean is more important to them than putting pressure on Lukashenko, which is a disappointment. And that also then makes it difficult for Germany and others to lead in this. Obviously, absence of US leadership here is hurting. We should be all over this, and it just feeds a narrative that somehow the US, even though the actions on the ground by the US, by this administration in Europe of reinforcing NATO are very good, the narrative and these kind of diplomatic actions don't match that, which I think is unfortunate. And then finally, I think the women of Belarus should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The incredible courage of women out there. They have really stepped out into the front, and you see that the police and security forces are starting to become rougher and rougher with them, yet they continue to turn out by the thousands. And that's who should be getting the Nobel Peace Prize, as well as our support.
Mr. Ambassador, as a former envoy to Kazakhstan and to,
okay, let me make one comparison.
what would you say in terms of U.S. diplomacy? How can we help on this matter?
We can help through public information, giving strong support to the opposition, but we don't want to get too far out ahead. It's better for the US, it's better for Europe if Europe is in front. And interestingly, just by coincidence perhaps, the Navalny poisoning on top of the Belarus has really angered a lot of Europeans. The Germans are now talking about a Magnitsky Act in the European Union. So if the US is not too far out in front, it makes it harder for the Russians to make a convincing case that somehow the US is behind all of this. And we really want the Europeans to take the lead because this is much closer to them. I would note a comparison that in the Maidan in end of 2013, Putin offered $20 billion in credits and energy subsidies to Yanukovych. Lukashenko got 1.5 billion, and most of that is just rolling over debt. So that suggests that the Kremlin doesn't want to invest too much right now anyway in Lukashenko, in part perhaps because they've seen that he's lost so much legitimacy, including among workers at least that one state factory that Lukashenko visited. So it's not clear exactly what's going to happen, but the Kremlin must be aware that if it supports Lukashenko too much, then there is a risk that, as in Georgia and Ukraine, that the protesters will turn westward and in fact will start going in the direction that David quite properly has said that they have not done so much in an overt way. So the risks are quite high for the Kremlin. And then the Kremlin also has its own problems in Khabarovsk and possibly also in some of the other regions. The Khabarovsk protests have been sustained, just like the ones in Belarus. So the Kremlin's options may not be quite as attractive as the Kremlin perceived them to be in the Maidan case when it backed Yanukovych.
Vikoras, I know that you being in Lithuania as a neighboring country to Belarus, how do you see either your government in Lithuania interacting with what is happening within Belarus and civil society as well? I think it's very important that we don't just concentrate all of our efforts on government institutions, but also as well in terms of civil society and what the rest of the world can do.
Well, I would say that if we would just remember Crimea and how world was slow to react and support or interact and or to agree that these green people are actually Russian military guys. So with Belarus, it's very chaotic, and there are so many people protesting. They're getting beaten, and Lithuanians kind of feel them by heart and try to support them. And Baltic countries were suppressed in Soviet Union, and to free from that was really difficult, and even by miracle that happened. And the things that are happening in Belarus, need to be supported, and they need to have a proper elections, and things need to change. And our government and Latvian and Estonian government also supporting that. We had 50,000 people on the streets going to support. It's a smaller thing than 1 million or like multiple millions people with the Baltic way, but it's still big. It's so many people going to streets and protesting, and elves moving and blocking those trolls. So we understand that this is our neighbor, and it's trying to be manipulated by Russia and trying to be integrated in Russia, and that makes the Baltic region much less secure. And I think that's a big security threat, and that's why we communicate about that a lot. And the maybe harder thing for Western countries to understand is that when you think that it's very far from you and it doesn't make any impact for your life, or so we are as a corridor, and one day we might see tanks going over here. So we need to be very we need to communicate about that. We are small countries. It's hard to defend being a small country. So you need to communicate the problems and try to unite different countries to work together. And all these disinformation campaigns, one of the main goals is to divide us. And it's much easier to conquer when people and governments and citizens are divided. And either Free CEEC initiative or other initiatives that are trying to create these joint operations and working together, this is one of the clues how to move forward and how to make the Western world stronger.
Vikoras, David, General Hodges, Ambassador Courtney, thank you very much for your time, for all of your efforts, for bringing your knowledge, your insights, any recommendations and your counsel on this particular topic. I know that we could talk for many hours and there are so many other subtexts associated with this. We truly appreciate your time. In the future, we look forward to advocate for a lot of these issues with our friends on Capitol Hill. To all the participants, thank you for participating. Thank you for being a part of this. Please stay tuned for additional information coming from the Central and East European Coalition, as well as potentially other webinars in the future. So thank you. To those in Europe, have a great afternoon. To those in the United States, have a good rest of the morning and have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you.